Thank you for managing to reach this pre-dawn convocation. I think this may be one of the more interesting educational events at this conference. We are very privileged today to have with us two of the leading participants in the debate about single-stage-to-orbit programs. From the point of view of the National Space Society, I think the key word is orbit, and single stage, in the minds of many, is the quickest, fastest, cheapest way of getting there. On the other hand, as I understand it, the views sometimes differ. So we have with us this morning to discuss this, first of all, Maxwell Hunter, who for many years, he's an engineer for many years, was with Douglas Aircraft in their early missile program, and then spent 22 years with Lockheed in Sunnyvale working on the shuttle, space-based weapons vehicle, Hubble program. Is currently president of a company called Space Guild, which does systems engineering, and for the last 2 years his company has been heavily involved in supporting McDonnell Douglas in their Delta Clipper program. And in the other corner, we have Terry Dawson, staff engineer on the House Subcommittee on Space, for the House Committee on Science, and as I reminded Terry last night, Space and Technology. Terry is one of the most knowledgeable persons in Washington on how Congress feels about this sort of stuff, and Terry also is known for having views that at times are divergent from those of a large portion of this audience. And the format I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Max to talk for about 10 minutes about some of the advantages of the SSTO programs as, I guess, are being proposed. I'm going to ask Terry to spend about 10 minutes discussing some of the difficulties with following up on this SSTO concept. Then I'm going to ask Max to respond for another 5 to 10 minutes, and then after that ask Terry to respond again for another 5 to 10 minutes. And depending on how long they've responded, we open it to the audience for questions. Theoretically, these are 45-minute programs. There is another program here at 10. We can probably go on a little bit longer, and when it is over, I will ask these gentlemen if they would not mind holding court in the foyer for those of you who might still have further questions, provided that all weapons are checked at the door. All right, gentlemen, I now give you Max Hunter, and thank you very much.
I decided to use a couple of charts to sort of set the background and try and put this in more of a context than just an argument over structural weight on SSTO.
Can you use the microphone, please? Microphone's not working. Can't hear you.
Can you not hear me?
Terry, Max? Use this one.
Okay, how's that? I tend to speak well anyway. My wife, who's an actress, gets very mad at me for not properly breathing. Get carried away by what I'm saying and forget to say anything. Now, I have been accused of single-mindedly pursuing single-stage-to-orbit rockets for about 30 years. And I want to set the record straight a little bit because it's not quite true. So I made up this little historical chart as to where some of this stuff had come from. What?
Higher. Erase the mirror. Shift the mirror up, and that'll shift it up.
Lower the floor.
Also, you are standing in front of it.
Well, Okay, if you want to. I want to take this clear back to a program that we did at Douglas only a month or two, or a year or so after Sputnik, called Rita. Rita was a single-stage nuclear rocket. We thought by doing it, we could greatly make, Rita stood for Reusable Interplanetary Transport Approach to space, and it was not a single stage to orbit. It was a single stage to the moon and back. So I'm going to get that point straight. Now, we looked at a lot of, in the early years, we looked at just about anything imaginable. And at Douglas, when we came up with this particular thing, it shocked us. Because the idea that you could do a single stage job at all, although you knew about them, it wasn't particularly credible. Now in this case, you had relatively high specific impulse engines, around 900 seconds, and so it seemed like the engine was key to everything. Now how that ties into this continuing saga is, once we thought we could do that, we shocked ourselves because we were trying to figure out what in the devil this implied for space, because they weren't the big multi-stage rockets that we all thought were necessary. And how did you assess that if you had something that radically different? So we made an assessment by willy-nilly applying to that rocket the Air Transport Association operating cost calculation methodology. We didn't know whether you'd ever have heat shields or various things that could do this, but we did that. And we got shockingly low costs. In 1960 money, things like $1 a pound to go to the moon and back. So some of us concluded then that we had this all wrong. That everyone was talking about this big shooting match and all the exotic stuff, and it looked to us somewhere along the line, we'd conquer space like we once conquered the air, and people were going to be very shocked at how good this could be. But we didn't know much what to do about it. Made a lot of presentations, made a lot of friends at Los Alamos, naturally. And I don't know that I'd ever go back to that these days. Incidentally, in those days, the nuclear phobia was nowhere nearly as highly developed as it is in this country now. So it didn't seem, if you made a rational analysis of making it safe that was accepted, these days it has to be a totally irrational analysis, and I think it would be a waste of time to go anywhere near it. But one thing that we did, almost accidentally, if you used the ATA analysis, you by definition were using airplane class maintenance. You did not have a large standing army of people. So we had slimmed down simple launch crews. Just because that's the way we do everything in the planet except space rockets. And if you had tried to tell some of us back here that we would ever face the monsters, tens of thousands of people just to launch a rocket, we would have said, you don't understand, that'll never happen. That's silly. And you will not find in this documentation, what little is left, you'll find all the sales pitch today. The reusability, the engine out capability, all that sort of stuff. You will not find a word that is a tirade against the standing army. Now, the next time I got embroiled in this was a program called Star Clipper when I went to Lockheed. And Star Clipper was a stage and a half. I used to try to get people to call it a pseudo single stage orbit. Because it seemed to me at that point in time, you might be able to do it structurally, but if you could, no one was going to believe it. It was going to be so doggone exotic, no one would do it. So why not try to get all the benefits of this by putting a lot of propellant in throwaway tanks and make the rest of it like a single stage orbit, as opposed to the shuttle that did not have auxiliary solid boosters. Again, it's the same sales pitch, if you will. And if Terry doesn't want to believe anything I say, I can understand that. Because I'm saying the same thing now I said here and I said there, and it didn't work out these times, so why the hell should you pay any attention to me? So let's get my qualifications straight here. Lockheed put a lot of effort into this, starting in '66. Part of that work is what eventually led to the shuttle towers. Actually, it was a lifting body. In fact, it looks remarkably similar to the current Skunk Works single stage to orbit, except we didn't try to carry all that fuel in the vehicle, and so we had these big throwaway tanks. The theoretical idea was it would never be as good as a single stage to orbit, but if you really worked the problem of getting low-cost auxiliary tanks, you might get sort of a compromise. And it wouldn't be as good as an SSTO, but it would sure as hell be better than anything else we were doing at the time. So that was that soiree. Again, we used the ATA calculations. Again, we were predicting, after adjustment for the cost of the throwaway tanks, a pretty remarkably low cost. And in this case, I know one of the things that we did at Sunnyvale, we wanted to work the problem of how small the launch crews could be, and I actually sent a team of people, spent about a week down to Skunk Works, comparing notes on what they were doing, figured anyone that could live with the SR-71 could probably live with anything. And there was a lot of good exchange back and forth there. But in general, this, some people feel, had a great deal to do with starting the shuttle. I don't know whether it did or not. When anything that big gets started, you can't figure out afterwards who did what. And anyone involved thinks they were the key person in it. You can't have 10,000 key people. But as the shuttle got underway, as far as I was concerned, you ought to relax a while. When a big program gets going, there's no point to going out on the soapbox and beating your head against everybody. And Werner von Braun put this very nicely one time. He said, when the program is as big as the shuttle gets started, it's like crossing a river in a rowboat with an elephant. If he rocks, you rock. If he doesn't rock, you don't rock. And if you want to rock the boat, you get to the other side and get that elephant out of there. So I personally did a lot of other things. Couldn't get heavily embroiled in the laser weaponry game. And then decided along about here to come back to it. And I was still at Lockheed Sunnyvale then. And we started a program which we called the Next Rocket, which sort of grew into the SSX and kind of grew on down here into some of these things. Now at that stage of the game, it was a deliberate tactical decision that I thought there's no point to talk to these rocket engineer people about air transport costing methodology. Just a total disconnect in terms of any means of an intellectual discussion. I thought cutting down these monstrous numbers of people was a very key thing. So this time, one of the gambits was to make a federal case out of the standing army. And in the charts we used to do some of this stuff, when I got to that part of it, the title on the first chart was the standing army problem, where in those previous soirees we had just automatically assumed that if we had these characteristics, people would probably do it right. It was an incidental, oh yes, and now that we have this, we'll make things real easy to use, we'll get rid of all those people. And it didn't take. So in this case, there was more of a deliberate making that a major part of the issue. So then, of course, this went on to another chart which I left off, going on to things like the DCX. One of the things we were driving at in that was the business that if you could cut down the numbers of people and that sort of thing, that it was one of the most fundamental things involved in this whole thing. It's far more fundamental than what's a single stage or a two stage. And you can make the case out in here with what we've now done, I think, that that's true. The keys to low cost are total reusability, getting rid of the standing army. The argument over whether it's horizontal or vertical landing, or even some mini staging, that's an argument among the damn engineers of how they built it. The driving forces here are you've got to cut down those massive numbers of people, and everything has to be reusable, and you'd better make it savable in case of things like engine failures. Now, take a look at the next one here. Just to give you a brief look, that's what a RIA looked like in 1961. Looks strangely like a lot of things we're doing these days. Makes you wonder. Yeah. Next one is a chart I thought I'd show you. This was made up at Lockheed in '86 because I was asked to make one chart that used only one for the management. What if you say, and if you'll notice, the thing I said is, eliminating the standing army is the truly crucial item, and it may be the only one. Now, having time problem, I'll skip that one. I want to make one quick foray, which I think is important to perspective. The problem of life cycle costing and how you make your decisions and how do you get at something as revolutionary as we're talking about. Now, Galvin showed yesterday, we use plots of cost per pound versus cost per flight. The reason being that nobody knows which is more important. So we made up this chart that here is all the things we've been doing, and here is what we think we can do with these new devices. Now, the reason this is potentially instructive is you're going to argue over mission models from now to 2050. But if you put something down in that corner, it's going to devastate all of these regardless of the mission model. And your mission models today come from extrapolations from the past. It all comes from up here. Now what that means is life cycle costing is an evolutionary tool. It is not something you use to assess a revolution if you have one going. And the point here is, if you make a plot of this, here's the life cycle cost, and these are cost per flight. And you notice I drew this out to 250 flights a year. Now, if you want to know where the transport airplane business is, over the wall there somewhere. It's a hell of a lot more than only 250 flights per year. Yet, when we do life cycle costing and we do massive mission modeling today to decide what to do next, it is all in this area here. The question of where the revolutions occur are out here. But we can't talk about them. Your credibility is no good. Try it in Congress, they say, what would it be? Well, it's probably space tourism. If back in here, you cannot choose between these various things, then it is my contention that this is so confusing and such a puny mission model that you can't do it. At least you ought to support the ones that out in here have revolutionary possibility. In a chart like this, 200 flights per ship, we talk about our culture change for airplane. 200 flights in an airplane? Oh, come on. If you do this for 2,000 flights, these curves fall right down on you, right down in there. So the only point I want to make is I think the way we assess these things, the backgrounds against which we try to draw our conclusions are really pretty grim. And a lot of it has to do with being overly preoccupied with life cycle costing. And I would simply stop by saying if the Douglas Aircraft Company had used only life cycle costing in 1933, there would have been no DC-3.
for the record, I apologize for not introducing myself. My name is Jeffrey Liss, and I'm a member of the National Space Society's Board of Advisors. Now I'll turn it over to Terry. Oh, incidentally, here's the schedule. Since notwithstanding our desirability to learn everything possible in a very short time, we're not going to be able to do it. And what I'm going to suggest is when this is over, instead of moving to the foyer, I believe the Saturn II room is over, and I'm going to suggest that you, if you those who want, continue in there. And I've asked Jerry Smith from the Zero G Destiny chapter of National Space Society to continue acting as moderator of it. Jerry is not on any public record on this issue, and I think it would be pretty safe. So that's what we'll do, but we'll still keep trying to do the 10-minute format back and forth, at least till the end of this hour, I think. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Max made reference to his qualifications. I think everybody in this room has great respect for Max and his qualifications. And in fact, when I find I'm on an opposite side of an issue from Max, I ask myself, well, what do I don't know that he does? A number of years ago, I went through a series of calculations on the basic physics of getting into orbit. If you look at a 1 pound mass in low Earth orbit, the mass has kinetic energy, it's moving 5 miles a second. It has potential energy, it's 100 miles up in the air. If you look at the total energy that's resident in that mass, 100 miles up in the air, moving 5 miles a second, calculate, as I say, the total energy it has, and then ask yourself the question, if I was to go to the local power company, in my case it's Pepco, and buy that amount of energy, how much would it cost? Turns out it costs less than $1. The amount of energy that's resident in a 1 pound mass in low Earth orbit, you can buy from your local power company for less than $1. We spend currently between $3,000 and $7,000 to put that 1 pound into orbit. Clearly, there is a lot of room for improvement. One of my goals in the near term is to try and get the cost of space transportation down. I think there's some things we can do in the near term. I think there's some things we can do in the long term. One of the problems we've had is in the last 20 or 25 years, we've been so busy grabbing for the gold ring, we haven't done the simple, straightforward, easy things that we can do to lower the cost of space transportation. There's a lot of things wrong with the way we build, design, process, manage, launch rockets. There's a lot of things we could do very simply in the near term to improve that. I think with the available technology we have with the existing vehicles, we can cut the cost of getting into space in half by simply focusing on simple, rugged, cost-driven designs with a lot of standardization, very simple procedures. And that's one of the things that myself and a group of my colleagues have been pushing for. And I think that's something that should be done, and the Air Force right now in the the Mormon studies and the like are determined to do some of those things to get down the cost of our current systems. In parallel with that, I think we need to invest in the future. If we're ever going to achieve the kind of goals and visions that you all have, we've got to get the cost of space launch down by 2 orders of magnitude. You aren't going to do that with the existing rockets and the kinds of technologies that they involve. So we need to be investing in the future. I tend to focus on and try and learn from the lessons in the past. Based on those lessons, I tend to be fairly skeptical of a lot of the claims that are made. Last night at dinner, I went through a history of problems, a history of failures of the space launch industry in this country. It dates back to the 60s with the Titan Integrate, Transfer, and Launch facilities. They were supposed to be simple, robust, cost-efficient, be able to launch on 6-day centers. It can do none of those things. The next was in the 70s, the shuttle program. It lived up to none of its goals and objectives. After that was the NASA program in the 80s. Once again, lived up to none of its objectives. I think there's some lessons there. Additionally, and it may be somewhat unkind, I think if some of these companies believed the rhetoric that I've seen in some of the briefings I've gotten, if they actually believed some of the things that we're saying, I don't understand why they haven't gone out and done these systems on their own. Because if the economics are as compelling as they say, it would be stupid not to go out and do them. A year ago, I asked an official at McDonnell Douglas where that company is putting its own money. Is it putting more of its own money on SSTO or a low-cost upgrade of the Delta? And I was told the company's putting its money into Delta. There's an old adage, fool me once, shame on me, or fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. And because of the abysmal performance of the space launch industry and achieving the objectives that it set out for itself, policymakers in Washington are skeptical and want to be cautious. NASA, or the Congress has turned to a number of groups for advice. NASA itself says that a viable SSTO is not achievable without more advanced technology and wants to spend the next several years developing that technology. The Air Force is even more skeptical. They claim that something called unobtainium is required in order for SSTO to be viable. I don't go that far. 2 years ago, we asked the National Research Council, the Academy of Sciences, to pull together the best minds in the country in space launch and propulsion issues and advise us on the options that are there for the future. In their report, they did talk about SSTO. They said they thought it was a very promising technology, but in their conclusion, it was not near term. I think the most practical and prudent thing to do is to invest in these technologies, but to do so in a steady, step-by-step way, requiring success at each phase before a contractor or an agency moves on to the next phase. I think the key is simple, rugged, reliable, low-cost space transportation. Now, some people seem to have embraced SSTO with almost a religious fanaticism. And the issue isn't one stage or multiple stages. It's finding simple, rugged, reliable, low-cost transportation. With advances in technology over time, the most viable, the most workable point solutions, or the solutions that are best at any particular time, are likely to change. Ultimately, I think something approaching a NASP, an air breather, may turn out to be the lowest cost way of getting into space. But it's also the hardest thing to do. Right now, it may turn out that the simplest, ruggedest, lowest cost approach would be a two-stage reusable system. One of the conceptual problems I have with the single-stage approach is the mass fractions that are required. The physics of the situation are such that given the specific impulses with current rockets. If we had Max's 900-second specific impulse nuclear engine, then it gets a lot easier to do with current rocket engines. You have to have, the vehicle has to have a mass fraction that exceeds the mass fraction of an egg. An egg is an engineering marvel and has a mass fraction of 0.89. To get to orbit, a vehicle has to have a mass fraction a little bit higher, about 0.90. Current rockets blow up 1 in 10.
Explain to some people what a mass fraction is.
Well, the answer is a little different with an egg and a rocket, but mass fraction on a rocket is the ratio of the, well, let me get this right, the total weight to propellant weight, or the other way around. It's how much of the vehicle is propellant and how much is dead weight. Mass fraction of 0.90 means that 90% of the vehicle is propellant, 10% is structures, propulsion, avionics, payload. In the case of an egg, the 0.89 is 11% of the egg is shell structure, and 89% is contents. Airplanes, as a comparison, have a mass fraction of 25% to 50%. 25 to 50% of the vehicle is fuel, 50 to 75% is structure, dead weight. There's a big difference in the reliability of airplanes and rockets. Airplanes don't blow up 1 in 10, 1 in 20, and seldom crash. And the difference is airplanes have very larger, significantly larger design safety factors, margins of safety, than do rockets. And you know, after 40 years of building and launching rockets, I don't understand why this country can't build a rocket that doesn't blow up. And the key is clearly going to be designing more ruggedness, more robustness into the rockets. Rockets today do blow up 1 in 10 and 1 in 20 and have mass fractions of in the high 70s, low 80s. Going to a mass fraction of 90 means that we may have to lower some of our design factors of safety, or at best keep them the same. I'm not sure that's good enough. I think with the technology that's available, it may be better to double, triple all of our margins of safety, have real heavy, clunky, rugged rockets, but vehicles that don't blow up. And again, that's not totally consistent with getting to orbit in a single stage, but it may be consistent in doing it in 2 stages. Yeah. I think we can do a lot better than we have in the past, and it's going to require us to do a lot of the things that Max talks about, getting rid of the marching army and focusing on systems that are simpler and require much fewer people to operate. I think reusable is also a key. But I also believe that ruggedness is and high reliability is equally important. So I think we need to pursue the technology. We need to actively develop the technologies that are required to eventually do single-stage NASPs or SSTOs, and see where the technologies lead us. And as I said, I think the point solutions will change with time. As technologies mature, what is an ideal solution in 1 decade may not be an ideal solution in the next decade. So we do need to invest in the future. We do need to move forward, and I, for one, will keep an open mind on what system, in fact, turns out to be the best way of approaching it.
Thank you. It's kind of nice to be a conduit as things go. I'm going to turn over to Max now for perhaps another 5 minutes of comments.
Sooner or later, we're going to have to get into this mass fraction business. And I would,
It is just a little closer. It's up. It's up.
okay. I like to throw in a few analogies that aren't just the egg analogy. This is also terrible. I think if Terry would look into the mass fraction of the Douglas S4B stage, which was the third stage of the Saturn V, that threw men away from the Earth to the Moon, you'll find it's about 0.91. If you look at a Gina rocket, you'll find it's about 0.94. Now that's what we were doing 20, 25 years ago. Furthermore, something that is widely not understood. Those upper stages take one hell of a beating compared to what happens in a single stage to orbit rocket. A single stage to orbit takes off at only maybe 1¼ Gs with full propellant load. Saturn S4B had to take 5 Gs beating from the S1's bottom stage and the S2 stage with a full propellant load carrying 90,000 pounds of payload on top. And we had 0.91. And it worked like a charm. We never had any failures. And that was pretty obsolete aluminum compared to what we have now. Furthermore, on this airplane game, I agree with what their mass fractions are. But airplanes are a hell of a thing. They carry wings, monstrous landing gears, things like that. An airplane carries an awful lot compared to a single stage to orbit rocket. We're much closer to a flying fuselage. So if you're going to make the first order comparisons with airplanes, at least you've got to make the comparison of airplanes without all of their heaviness and complexity, and then see what we can learn. So I guess I think we have not learned we do not put our mass fraction game in perspective. And this thing, the Gina is a pretty small rocket, and most people go around saying the bigger the merrier. If you can do 0.93 or 0.94 down that small, why are we having so much trouble with the larger sizes? And as I recall, the mass fraction of the external tank of the shuttle, which is closer to the egg in that it doesn't have any propulsion on it, is something like 0.96. Well over twice as good as an egg. So I don't think the egg analogy is very useful.
I think you got the other reasons. I think it's point
What?
69. I
Huh?
think you said 0.96. I think you meant 0.69.
No, 96.
No, it probably is.
Yeah. These numbers are readily available, except if you guys are like me, every time I look for one, it takes me 3 hours to find a book where it's stored. They are available, but they do not volunteer. Now, I'd like to make another comment. On the subject of NASP, I don't think we're going to wake up in 30 or 40 years and find NASP is the way to go. My view of how you get things done in Washington, D.C. and most anywhere else is the basic idea is to be so simple and rational it just sounds logical to anyone. And if it's wrong, the counter takes an afternoon of engineering wrangling. I think NASP is basically wrong. The story has always been, we know what's wrong with rockets. They have to carry their oxidizer on board. Isn't that horrible? And we will get ours for free from the atmosphere. Now, you know, that sounds very good. Even the president of science advisor thought that was great, but you've got to understand he was only a nuclear physicist. Now, in fact, when you're flying subsonically, you almost do get your air for free in a normal airplane. But when you open up to the airstream out there, what you're getting in the scoop is not only oxygen, you're getting 4-to-1 nitrogen, which isn't very useful. You're getting adverse momentum and adverse kinetic energy, and those adverse energy terms have to be circumvented, have to do something greater. Now those adverse forces coming up when the square go up with the square speed. So maybe at Mach number 1, this isn't too bad. At Mach number 25, it's hell. What's coming in those inlets is pure murder. And the air breathing people don't like to want to talk to them. And we've done some analysis where, this was done while I was still at Lockheed, where we assumed perfect combustion efficiency and all that. And it didn't look very good. Furthermore, when you read in that week that someone measured thrust, remember, in the mass, it's only thrust minus drag that is important, not thrust. And that makes one hell of a difference when you're going to space with a rocket. As you get out of the atmosphere, it's only thrust. So I think as time goes on, the NASP will go away. We are talking about going to space. We are not talking about living in the atmosphere forever. And I think we have problems. Another thing I would make one just brief comment. I agree with Terry's energy numbers for a pound on orbit. It's remarkably small when you look at it, and it's a kind of a shocking thing. But in the pro-air breathing argument also neglects the fact that rockets are very, very good. They're very efficient. And I've had many people stand up and say, well, you're wasting all that energy accelerating the oxidizer. But where does the energy go? It goes into the oxidizer. When you want to make a high velocity thing act like a rocket, you want the fuel going with the rocket in the tanks. As you accelerate it, you are generating high energy propellant. And if you take a look at the final kinetic energy of all that mass and compare it to the energy released in the exhaust, you will find it's about 60% efficient. Far better than any Chevrolet you're ever going to get. That way of looking at it is almost unknown in this country or anywhere today, yet it was clearly analyzed and understood by Tsiolkovsky in his 1903 Russian paper.
A couple thoughts here. On the mass fraction, I agree with what Max says about high mass fraction of some upper stages. And I would point out that an upper stage is not a whole vehicle. The mass fraction on some of the filament wound case upper stages is 94, 35, and there may be one that's 96. The external tank, I agree, is probably 0.96 as a mass fraction. But when you add the weight of engines, you add the weight of avionics, you add the weight of payload, you add the weight of the recovery system, which is the orbiter, then your mass fractions drop to the 70s or 80s.
No.
Well, the shuttle does not have a mass fraction that's above the 80s.
This is the NASA study.
Now, I'm talking about the space shuttle.
The space shuttle isn't a single stage door vehicle. It was never designed to be.
Right. No, I'm commenting on a case that was raised, that the external tank has a mass fraction of 9.6.
The external tank demonstrates that you can construct hydrogen-oxygen tanks at a certain mass fraction, nothing more.
Another issue here is specific impulse. Max talks about the problems with that and the efficiencies of rockets. Rocket engines have a specific impulse in the hundreds. Air breathers have specific impulses in the thousands. So it is generally easier to get into orbit with the higher specific impulses than the lower. Now, on the other hand, rockets spend a very short time in the atmosphere with the drag and the problems that the atmosphere gives. A NASA vehicle, by its very nature, spends almost all of its time in the atmosphere. You have stagnation air temperatures that exceed the surface temperature of the sun. There are huge problems in trying to do that. Molecules in the combustion chamber spend very, very small fractions of a second inside the engine. And trying to get something that works with those sort of constraints is very, very difficult. As I look back in history, in December 18th, 1958, an Atlas rocket put itself into orbit. That was a 1.5 stage vehicle. And clearly, if in 1958, using the then very, very rudimentary technology, an Atlas launch vehicle could put itself into orbit, clearly we can do a lot better today. Single stage, I don't think anybody disagrees that you could design and build a rocket to put itself in orbit with one stage. The tougher problem is recovering it and reusing it, because that adds a lot of additional weight. And one of my concerns is having a vehicle that's so rugged that it would be reliable over many, many flights. But I don't say it can't be done, and I say we need to try. But I don't think it's going to be a task without challenges and without difficulty.
Okay, thank you. I regret that I'm not going to be able to be a continuation of this. I do have one question I would like to see addressed, though. I'm from Chicago. We're 1,000 miles away from any real aerospace centers. And one of the things I keep hearing is that one group says we can get a workable full-size SSTO for about $2 billion, and another group says we can do it, but it'll take $40 billion if it works. I'd like to ask our participants in this panel sometime after this to address the question of best projections of cost to develop a workable system. I'd like again to introduce Jerry Smith. Would you stand up? Jerry is the boss. Those of you activists who are familiar with Jerry, he's the boss, and be gentle with him, okay? And also be gentle with the great Satan in our midst. Let's go adjourn. The Center 2 room, I believe, is around that direction. And if somebody might notify the people making the audio tapes that we're adjourning there, maybe they will want to pick up the second half of this.
For those that are coming in here, I think everyone was in the beginning of this program, or this debate, if you want to call it. Once again, I want to thank the two individuals for being with us today. Of course, Max Hunter and also Terry from the advisor for the space subcommittee in the House. Anyway, I want to correct one thing that Jeff Liss said earlier on, saying that he thought that I did not have a public record or be on record as far as my opinion on the subject. I think I agree with a lot of you that we need low-cost space transportation. I think that's what I advocate. I don't advocate a certain vehicle. I think low-cost space transportation is something everybody here in this room wants. Unfortunately, Jeff failed to see that I'm wearing a DCX lapel pin. Anyway, I think when Jeff Liss left, he posed a question as far as developmental cost of the next generation or the generation of single-stage to orbit vehicles. And I think that's a very pertinent question, and I think maybe if we could address that and have Terry and Max address that, I think that's a good starting point for this the continuation of this session. Terry,
Say again.
I think the question that Jeff proposed was, in fact, the development cost for single-stage to orbit vehicles has varied, has proposals from $2 to $4 billion to $40 billion, and time spans varying from 2 to 5 years to 20 years.
Gee. I don't believe the low numbers. Somebody the other evening was quoting a statistic of what Boeing is paying to develop the latest in their 777 series. It was a development cost. I've heard numbers of like $6, $7, $9 billion to develop a commercial airliner with available technology. Now, clearly, airliners have to go through certification processes that rockets don't. But I think that's an indication that if it costs so much to develop a commercial airliner using available technology, trying to develop a rocket vehicle, doing something that's never been done before. And people refer to these programs as leapfrog technologies. We do it for a reason. I don't believe that it will be as cheap as $5 billion as some people claim. NASA estimates, and NASA tends to underestimate the cost of things. NASA's
If they depend on whether they want to do it or not.
You're right, and they do want to do this one. And in spite of the fact that they do want to do this one, as you say, their report recommends doing this program. And that report says this program is $37 billion.
I think it's more like $18 billion.
Well,
They also
let
assume
me-
that it's business as usual without any stream of management.
Let me explain. That number is broken into two parts. It's $19 billion of development cost, followed by an $18 billion bill to build and equip a fleet of 6. So the $37 billion is to develop the system and then to build and equip a fleet of 6. Some of the cost curves that are included in the NASA report that I had some question about have to do with, the other evening I mentioned that within the shuttle program, there's the ratio of support to touch labor, and what that is. For every person in the space shuttle program that's touching a piece of hardware, for every one of those, NASA has 7 people supporting them. So the ratio of support to touch labor is 7 in the shuttle program. NASA's assuming that the ratio for the SSTO manned system that they developed is 0.3. Now, that's a big, huge step in the right direction, and exactly what Max and others want. I question, though, whether NASA can actually do that. Other people may be able to, but I wonder whether NASA can. Those ratios are not so much an issue of engineering or as they are management philosophy. NASA does not have to maintain the ratio of 7-to-1 for the shuttle. They choose to operate it that way. The shuttle wasn't going to be that way when it was envisioned. The space station, just a few years ago, NASA used to describe the space station management and support as a very, very sparse operation. The space station was going to be autonomous and managed from orbit. JSC in Houston was going to operate on 1 shift a day, 5 days a week. Be a very small crew, and their basic role would be to send up telephone messages. That is not the way NASA sees the space station now. The crew has gotten so big that they won't even fit in the current building. NASA's building a huge new mission control building for space station. The agency, though I grouse at them a good bit about the way they do these things, they do it for a reason. The viability of their programs are dependent upon success. And when NASA gets into a program like the shuttle or some other manned system, they start thinking, well, people are involved here. And if there are failures, people will lose their lives. We do it on primetime television, our program's going to go right down the toilet. So we want to have people watch people do work, and checkers to make sure everything is exactly the way it should be. And they end up having very large ratios support to later. But anyway, what led NASA to some of its cost conclusions was this assumption that they would have these huge reductions in support to touch labor. they can do that now with the shuttle. If they choose not to, I'm skeptical that they will actually embrace such ratios in the future. So I'm long-winded rambling. I think this is likely to be an expensive venture. I think there are cheaper ways to do things. In the past, development programs in this country tend to have a high degree of concurrency between technology development and vehicle design and development. I think that's a mistake. I think a better approach is develop the technologies, have them in hand, and then when you sit down to develop the vehicle, it becomes more of an engineering exercise. I think that is a much cheaper, straightforward way to do development programs. I don't know that Max disagrees, and I'll turn this over to him, that with some of those concepts. I think he argues that the way you get those technologies is by doing demonstrators and the likes, and when you get down to a final vehicle, it's...
Why don't you go ahead and get my...
Okay.
As you can probably gather, Terry and I do agree on a number of things. I just dislike his cotton pick and egg analogy. I think the question of costing is extremely difficult to assess.
It's not a microphone.
It's just for tape.
It's feed.
Okay, I'll try to put a little more in it. If you take the Boeing 777 or any of the new Douglas transports or things like that, they do come up with billions right away quick. And one of the things I think is difficult to assess is you're setting up a production line as well as all those flight tests and all that sort of thing. Plus the point I was trying to make earlier, they are basically a more complicated device. Now, we know a hell of a lot about them compared to what we used to. But that wing structure is very complex. They're a far more complex thing than our space vehicle. Now, a single-stage spaceship, unfortunately, has to have a heat shield, which we don't exactly have off the shelf in good form. Doesn't have lousy inlets that gets its propellant out of its tanks, relatively straightforward way. The engines are basically probably simpler, except the energy density in the combustion chambers is higher, so they tend to get a little hotter and a little, you can get wrapped around the axle pretty bad. But I think it's difficult, and then when you turn, if you take the estimates Lockheed presented yesterday, gee, a couple billion in 3 years we can fly a demonstrator, 5 million in 5 years, a full-scale vehicle. I doubt seriously if that was aimed at having an operational fleet of vehicles. And if you go down through the NASA costing, they don't want to make it low or high because Congress gets mad at them either way. And so the next thing you know, they start off with a low estimate, and then they're saying, well, now what's this program for the whole next 30 years? I don't know whether anyone ever correlates some of these numbers compared to the ground rules, because I think a lot of the times the ground rules are what are causing the numbers to float all over the place. Now, if you're as old as I am, I got into this business in the middle of World War II, just about 50 years ago. Next month is in fact. And the first thing I worked on was some bombers and some transports. And everyone knows life was terribly different then. And so you can't go around using these analogies all over the place. But during both of the really serious wars, people talked about wartime production of Americans. If you looked at what happened, we got excited, we thought it was important, we flushed the system. And certainly you had miracles. In fact, I understand the French have said, stated for years, the Americans are only useful in cases of dire emergency. Now, if you look at, we've been in space for over 35 years now. We still have this very exotic, lousy ratio of observers to touchers and that sort of thing going on. It's terribly exotic. 35 years after the Wright brothers, the DC-3 was flying normal people all over the planet. Somewhere we lost our touch on trying to really do those things. And now, of course, we're trying to do them rationally. I tend to agree with Terry that going out and doing some good research is appropriate. But research has become a major growth item in this country. And it's one thing to say you want enough technology backup to know what you're doing. And it's another thing to let the technology weenies determine when you move next, because they'll want 10 or 15 years of research. They will every time, whether it's needed or not. And in there, some of us need it, but I think we go wrong by wanting a consensus of the gatherer fraternity, the information gatherers, to decide when you're going to move out and do something. And this makes it very difficult to estimate cost or timing. Both cost and timing depend on national motivation. Hell, we can't even get the engineers to agree on eggs versus aluminum tanks. That's a much simpler thing than just getting national motivation involved in other things. And I guess one more comment, I got back to my crises comment. The good news these days is we're too chicken to have World War III, which I'm in favor of. If you think we wouldn't get rid of this non-touch labor in one day flat. Now, since we can't have World War III to stimulate the cotton-picking Americans, what we should have had, way overdue, a race of Martian battle cruisers up there. You think we wouldn't change so damn fast as frightening, and they'd be the same people. Change like that. So the problem is all the fault of the Martians.
Before I open it up for questions, I have one comment that I would like to make personally also, that maybe Terry and Max can follow up on. The Office of Space Transportation policy drafts have been running around over the last month or two, and they talk, if you're not familiar with them, the policy statement, which is a maybe not visionary statement by any means, but looks at the Air Force developing some upgrades to existing expendable launch vehicles, and it also then says that NASA would be the lead center for developing single-stage-to-orbit technologies, which in the process would lead to a decision, I believe, in fiscal 97, if I'm incorrect with
It
that.
just changed to the calendar 97.
Calendar 97, not fiscal year. Anyway, what that basically said is that NASA would become the lead center for SSTO technologies, and in fact, if in fact the technologies look doable, that decision point would be a point at which NASA would develop a suborbital or a test vehicle to continue SSTO technologies. The only thing that I say is that, of course, 1997, 98 is a long time away. A lot of research has been undergoing. And unfortunately, those who are familiar with the Delta Clipper program know that Delta Clipper was built relatively fast, very cheaply, with a streamlined management system. Many of the audience has, I guess, problems or questions about NASA being able to do a program quickly, cheaper, and in that time period. And I think Terry is exactly right. We can't, any program that's going to reduce the cost, the vehicle itself is one thing. That's in the corner. We know technologies are either here or becoming available for us to build single stage to orbit vehicles, whether they're NASP, Delta Clipper, Lockheed proposals. I don't think that's the actual question. The only thing is, if we build a vehicle that'll work economically and speedily and fast turnaround, which we all want, but if we've got 3,000 people sitting back in the room writing papers and not touching the vehicle, I think as our panelists have talked, I think that's something that we need to, I think, funnel our attention on as much as hardware. I mean, it's a hardware question that we're discussing, but it goes much beyond that. if Terry and Max can touch base a little bit on, maybe design or lead agencies, and if what their thoughts are and what we can do to reduce that part of the cost equation.
I don't shut off the cameras, I can talk more freely.
Very losing your job.
There are a number of possible agencies one could consider to do this work. NASA is very anxious in taking on the assignment. I and some others have had some very frank discussions with people at Marshall headquarters that if this is going to be a public works program for engineers at Marshall, this is not going to work. DARPA, or now ARPA, Advanced Research Projects Agency in the Pentagon, is a very capable agency. The Air Force has had a number of successes. So there are some strengths and weaknesses of all of the possible agencies one could consider. There seems to be a consensus within the Warman Group, which included not only Air Force, NRO, and Commerce, NASA, and Transportation, White House, and the Congress, that the division of responsibilities that are being kicked around the town are a reasonable one. That the military would take responsibility for expendable systems using current technology. NASA would take the lead for advanced technology reusable systems. As I say, there appears to be a consensus within Washington that that's a reasonable thing to do. We've talked in the past about the strengths of government and the strengths of the private sector. There are some people now who think that maybe the role of NASA, instead of developing the system, should be to bring to a greater level of maturity the technologies that are required for a viable system, and then let industry. That's something that is being seriously considered among policymakers in Washington. I think NASA would like to take it the whole way, but that's something that does need more thought and more discussion. What's the best way to do this?
I want to go back to my kinds of motivation thing. It's very difficult. I agree with Harry's hesitancy on all of this. You just can't figure it out. But one of the things happened on the Delta Clipper program, and it was something I argued for back when we were setting the program out before McDonnell Douglas won it. We have this picture of massive amounts of systems and people, and it was my contention that this is not a fault of modern engineers, it's a fault of the bureaucratic system. And that if in fact you gave some of these guys their head and they could run free, that they'd probably do it just as lively as we used to. And that is precisely what happened on the Delta Clipper program. For a couple of months, the guys were running around acting figuring out how they got to this thing and what are they doing. And these guys are customers. They finally found they were being given relatively free rein. Well, they were scrounging parts all over the country. The damn thing has Thor actuators, and those Thors are about actuators are about 40. I don't know where they found them. Some of my people probably put them there once 40 years before. And I found that interesting. Now, if I go back to some of the things that happened when we moved certain programs fast, there's a tendency to say, well, this is all the good old days. But I've seen the bureaucracy jump out of bed and run like mad, and this happened in the early parts of the ballistic missile program. And a lot of people like to talk about the Polaris program and the negative things the Navy did. The Air Force, right in the heart of this bureaucracy, just jumped the track. Schriever was taken out of right field. It's a wonder they didn't put it in Hawaii. They wanted to get it as far from the bureaucracy because the national motivation was very, very clear. As far as I know, it came from Eisenhower himself, because we were tracking Russian ballistic missiles and we didn't have anything like that anywhere near our inventory. So there was a motivation that sort of came down and said, knock off this crap and go do things. And this was General Curtis LeMay's Air Force, the greatest flapping wing bomberman in history. And I always thought that I was pretty sure that Ford Czar General LeMay had explained to him by 5-star General Eisenhower where his next fitness report was coming from. Now, I know in the Navy, if you look at one of the things the Navy did, when you talk about sneak hearing, they knew after the first year or two, when they got started seriously on Polaris, they could put the submarine out in about 4 or 4.5 years. They advertised selling it. And then when they did it right on their original schedule, they bragged about their magnificent management system. And you had to have known what was going on there to catch them at this. But again, if you envision yourself, you got a couple of stars on your shoulder, you can line up Captain Zilch and say, look, I don't care what I told the New York Times yesterday. Your fitness report is based on an original schedule, not the number that we gave out. As nearly as I can tell, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force were all performing rapid fire, miracles, they were doing it very slick. So we were a little reckless here and there. We did blow up a few missiles and a few things like that. But all of that was done in the teeth of very heavy government, bureaucratic procurement systems, just as bad as we face now. What I don't see is how we can get the kind of motivation from on high that causes people to just plain jump the track and feel they can get away with it.
Questions? Alan?
You said that Congress is behind the economy of having NASA work on SSTO. I disagree with that. Representative Schroeder's subcommittee and was voted on by the full committee just reported out their bill. And in it, they're putting in $100 million for the SX2, and they quite clearly state that they want NASA to have nothing to do with it because they want to reward the good work done by the SSRT team. And I think it's unconscionable that the other people in Congress want to take people that have got a good track record building real hardware and shut it down. And instead do more paper studies, more research on crap turned green paper into white papers. And why don't you go out there and build something? You've got the technology. The stuff is there. Go out and do it.
That was done by that committee because they didn't think NASA would have any money to do.
No, they said they want NASA to have nothing to do with it. They said they were speaking in favor of the track record of the SSRT team. As a matter of fact, they also put in $100 million for upgrades of expendables, and they said quite clearly that they wanted the SSRT people doing it because they're the ones who know how to do things.
Have you talked to the people that wrote that bill?
Not directly. But I read the bill.
I talked to the people that wrote it. They told me the thinking behind it.
Well, why did they say that in the bill then?
Well, what I'm telling you is what they told me.
That suggests they are not in touch with reality because the whole issue here is getting people who know how to get the job done instead of giving it to people who clearly do not.
The people who had the job, I mean, that program was funded out of the MDO, and they don't want that mission anymore.
No, they've been directed not to do it since the ballistic missile. Basically, we've gone to a policy now of ground-based defense, in which case a launch vehicle doesn't make sense for operating with a ground-based defense. So it is not logical for the ballistic missile defense organization to create a launch vehicle. On the other hand, their organization has proven that they are more capable than NASA in doing that.
There's no reason that Colonel Ward and Major Spondel can't be spun off of VMDO and go off and do something like they've been doing.
They discussed it with the Pentagon. That's not what they want to do.
Yeah,
Well,
go ahead.
well, then, but since these guys are doing it and the Pentagon doesn't want to, it sounds like that's a problem. So why don't you lobby to get things done instead of producing more paper?
Again, the Defense Department has laid out a plan that they want to pursue. The White House seems to be in agreement, and most of the Congress, as far as I know, is in agreement. And the
Yes,
re-
but we
the
want
reason-
something done.
We want to do things.
The reason why Armed Services put money in the DoD bill to do SSTO is because they didn't think that NASA would have any money to do the program. And they don't want to see the program die. We've been told that, and the reason for the words in there about keeping NASA out of it is Air Force has gotten burned, DoD's gotten burned several times on joint programs where the Congress took money that had been appropriated to the Armed Services Committee, or Armed Services arena, and mirrored it over to NASA. And they said they don't want to see Armed Services authorized appropriated money going to NASA.
I don't care about the reasons. I'm just an engineer. I see people doing good work, and I see other people trying to shut them down because they're doing good work and not producing paper like they ought to be. And that's doing the right thing.
No, but I mean, they're shutting themselves down.
Well, then you're in the Congress. You have oversight responsibility. Why don't you do something about that?
My oversight responsibility is NASA.
You've got Kirk McConnell, a friend of yours?
Yes.
Well, then why don't you go talk to him? Why don't you convince him to do it? Why don't you lobby for it? You're capable of doing that, aren't you?
We talk all the time.
Okay, you also put together a presentation recently with Kirk McConnell and other people where you're trying to formalize stuff, where you're trying to unify all this stuff.
Yes.
This would be in performance of what you're trying to do.
Yes.
So why don't you do what you're trying to do by giving the people who are doing something the ability to get something done?
That issue is being worked.
But you're working by shutting it down. That's not
I'm
working.
shutting it down.
No, government is shutting it down, and the problem is that government doesn't know what it's doing.
Further company.
Next question.
Bureaucrats are taking over. You know what we want to do, you're just not doing it, and what we want to do, that's all.
Okay, well, there's limitations. Exactly. I think all of our comments are in fact very viable, and I think Terry realizes our feelings here, and hopefully he can get the gist of our message by our questions today. Dale, I think it's stand up now.
What do I say? The debate, as I've heard it, in a way, was more on DCX, single stage to orbit. The terms of, I think, what most of the people in the room are really interested in is a viable new way, or actually old way, of building hardware, where versus a method that has been proven to be incapable of creating anything. We will, if DC type project goes to NASA and they want to spend $19 billion for it, I will lobby to kill it. I do not want a $19 billion program. I want to build a little, fly a little. If it works, great. If it doesn't work, kill it.
Or change it as needed.
Sure, we're not talking about any rights of the better enabling
No.
legislation.
We've broken down incrementally.
I hesitate getting into this. I have some difference in the philosophy of build a little, fly a little when it comes to rockets. When one thinks about air breathers, NASP, and trying to advance aeronautic technologies, I think you're exactly right. The only way to do it is build a little, fly a little. We do not have the numerical codes. We do not have the wind tunnels and the test hardware that's required to verify concepts and know whether or not they will work. The only way to verify a theory, to verify a concept, to verify an engineering proposal is to fly it when it comes to aeronautical vehicles. And that was one of the reasons, in my opinion, why the NASA program did not succeed, because they were trying to do everything on paper, everything in the computers. They wanted to go from where we are now to a Mach 25 vehicle in one step, it's like going from the Wright brothers flyers to the 747 with nothing in between, and I think it was a huge mistake. That is not the case, in my humble opinion, with rockets. Rockets spend very little time in the atmosphere. We do have the codes, we do have the wind tunnels, we do have the test equipment that's required pretty much to verify whether or not the rocket concept will work before you fly. Now, what I argue is, given the consistent history of failure of the space launch community to deliver on their claims, again, I am very suspicious. Fool me twice, shame on me. I would rather see $2 million tests and $20 million tests verify components, verify materials, verify concepts before we go spend $200 million or whatever it is to build a demonstrator. So ultimately, I think you need to build a demonstrator, but personally, I'd like to see a little more evidence of probable success before we do.
I'd like to see multiple demonstrators of different types, let the best one win.
Competition or a fly-off, like the Air Force.
I have a slight disagreement with Terry on this. If you look at the kind of vehicle we're now talking about, not only do you have to worry about the aerodynamics, which I agree, no big deal compared to that cockpit and mass. We want vehicles that, at least as far as I'm concerned, are able to abort from engine failures anywhere during flight. That's new for the rocket business. It was in a lot of the old designs, but this is the first time that too has settled in. Now, people have to feel emotionally good about things. There's such a thing as building confidence. I think one of the spectacular results of those DCX flights, no one had ever seen a rocket do that before. It wasn't a big deal. That if I couldn't build a single stage the whole way to orbit, I think you can make a case of a suborbital job, which is not going to have any problems about sorting out obscure aerodynamics, but just flying them, doing abort runs, doing all sorts of things like that. Letting people see that it may not have got totally hot, but at least it's a reusable thing if they ever saw a reusable rocket before. The general question of building confidence in the engineers and the politicians, the general public, is also a very valid objective in this sort of thing. And I think perhaps for those reasons, we should be doing more of this than I think Terry wants to do.
Gentleman in blue has been.
Okay, Mr. Dawson, this is primarily for you, and I agree with what you said that most of the time we've been doing real big steps, and as a result we haven't always gotten what we wanted. The DCX project, from everything that I see, from what I read, they've done their small step now, they've done their little demonstrator, they proved that it works, now they want to go on to the next stage of demonstrator. And I'm going to quote from one of the things you said earlier as near as I can get. The key is success in each stage of development before making it to the next. And it sounds like that's the management philosophy they're following. It sounds like that's what you want. And I really am confused as to why you can't support what they're doing if that's the case. None of the other projects, the Delta, I guess the Delta Clipper, the hypersonic transport, all those wanted to go from nothing to full-scale project. And this is the only one doing it step by step.
I have no disagreement with step by step. The disagreements between some of us and Max is what those steps are. I want to see laboratory work, field tests, demonstrating probable success before you go the step of building a demonstrator.
Isn't that just what they've done though?
It's decided.
Well,
step.
see,
What is your next step? Maybe that may clarify.
As I mentioned the other night, I think one has to identify the key technologies. In this case, I think the materials, or structural materials and reentry materials are probably
I'm afraid you left out Dr. Salko's work, which is really the basis here of a single-stage orbit launch vehicle.
I guess the question, Terry, is that a lot of us feel that technology, although not fully proven and integrated, obviously, is either in hand or can be modified. Granted, the propulsion end of the equation needs to be addressed, and that needs to be started. As you know, propulsion is a long lead item for any vehicle. But as far as materials, composites, a lot of work that was in fact done on the NASA program. I guess if you could identify a little more, whether it's tankage, mass structure, or the engines, where do you see that the NASA or whatever development agency right now should be focusing their attention on directly?
Well, I don't think the problem is propulsion. I think it's structural materials and reentry materials.
Which materials?
No.
Which materials?
The whole basis of single stage to orbit has been based on Dr. Salko's work, which is propulsion.
Well,
But I would ask my opinion. I've given it, and I've told you that we have had some of the best minds in the country, independent groups, look at this.
And they're idiots.
I don't think that's going to get us anywhere.
The next step.
We're straight on, but I know just have a counter
As I say, I think the keys are structural materials and reentry materials. On the structural materials, I think the step-by-step process that one needs to demonstrate is step one, demonstrate that the materials that are required to build one of these flying machines can be produced in the lab. The second step, demonstrate that they can be produced in a manufacturing environment. Third step, build, as half region and some of these other things, build some of the major structural components on the vehicle. Cryogenic tankage is one of the tougher problems. Build, test them, and verify that the physical properties that are required have been demonstrated.
Can I address what Rick has done on all those areas? What?
Can you address my?
Can you address Dr. Salko's work?
Well, actually, it's pretty confused, and it's hard to address it individually, but much as I basically dislike agree with Terry, I do agree. I believe that Salko proved it was all propulsion. I think he got it dead wrong. This is a structured problem.
No, it isn't.
What's just letting up?
If you had zero weight structures, then take a look at the equation and see what you get. And you won't give a damn what you do with that propulsion. Now take a look at those extremes. Now, I knew Bob real well. What he and Louis Michael were pushing was a very interesting idea, but it only gives a 50% here and there. It's being researched a lot these days in the tri-propellant studies. NASA is looking at it like mad. It gets lighter. It is not the be-all and end-all. The NASA fallacy, as far as I'm concerned, is believing that all of this was a propulsion problem. I go back to my reading charts. That's what I thought in those days. I'm just smarter. After a while, you get it through your thick skull. It's the structure that is basically the problem. And incidentally, when you look at the engines, one of the things that comes out of it is you need good thrust-weight ratio engines, almost as good as you need good ISP engines. So there's, as far as I'm concerned, a disconnect between me and most of the propulsion fraternity. Most of them know I'm a little skeptical about their toxic attitudes.
What's your assessment on state materials?
Huh?
What's your assessment on state materials?
Well, there are a number of options on the thermal protection system. I'm not quite sure what's best, but I'll tell you, compared to 1970, when we were starting the shuttle, it's nice to know there's a whole bunch of options out there.
So they exist.
And that's, although I grumble about the shuttle as much as anyone else does, there's one thing good it did technology-wise, since the reusable heat shield, which was not a ventilator, was viewed as a key item. Everybody started doing work, Ames, Lankenfield, on the kind of heat shields we want. The French have done excellent work on Hermes. There's something like that very interesting. The latest versions of Tommy and Duratomy, that they call it out of Ames, is interesting.
What material is that?
What?
You said Duratomy, or what material is that?
It's their usual blanket-like based on the Lockheed work that they found on a metallic outer surface. And I was involved in starting a shovel tiles. Some guy walked through my desk at Lockheed, that was a Lockheed development. And I made a mistake. As he came in and the research lab was doing this for internal insulating. It's chalk-like stuff, so I stuck a fingernail in it and said, you're out of your head. And he said, you could put it on the outside. He said, no, we can coat it. Now, when I look back on that, we were spending enough money. I should have said, okay, let's develop the coating, but I want you to develop as a core for sandwich material at the same time. About a year and a half ago, the Lockheed Sunnydale plant started looking into that material as a core of the sandwich material.
What you
And
got
I
outside?
could easily have had a parallel development stream, and I just never clicked over in my mind. So there is the development stream of that sort of thing. There's the metallics. Now, as far as the basic structure, of course, everyone gets all excited about composites, but for good reasons. But if you look at some of the weight breakdowns of some of these vehicles, everybody says tanks, tanks, tanks. Most of the time, it's not the tanks, it's everything else. And some of these other structures in their composites go very well. And in some of the tanks, aluminum lithium is pretty good. Now, you immediately get people saying, but we do not have a lot of data on reusability of these kinds of things, and therefore we must test for reusability forever. And I guess my reaction is I would start down those programs, but I would not hold the development of the flight vehicle. Or if so, I would only hold it for a few months. So this stuff was leading on me. There's night crack about this one. I was doing all the work in my early career on things like Sparrow and Nike and all those things. NACA, plus the Air Force labs, plus the Army labs, the Navy. We're doing all sorts of gathering information. And I never once went to the NACA and asked their permission for what to do next. And they were horrified at some of the things we did. Because they couldn't get that, they couldn't test it. This is the point Terry was thinking about flight testing on the mast yesterday. I just think it applies to more than aerodynamics. It's one thing to have good getting of data. It's another thing to wait till those personalities are totally happy before you go out and do something. And this is the dilemma that I think we have in our mission.
Let me follow up there. I agree with Max completely. Engineers do tend to want to over-test. And do we need to protect against that? Absolutely.
What about structures that have region? As a structures engineer, I'd love to get into the nitty-gritty detail of this, but I have a policy question. So apologies to our Canadian hosts who will go over it. We face a critical problem in the launch industry with the decline of our commercial launch services and legacy. Washington has waking up to that issue in all these reports, which doesn't seem to have a lot of consensus to it, but at least there's some action going on. When I spoke to Dr. Gaudax about finding this does not fund internally work on these type of vehicles. His answer was that they're afraid of government competition, that Donald Lewis will spend money, develop a vehicle, and then the U.S. government will come along and say, that's a great idea, we're going to let Lockheed do it, and give Lockheed all that money. My question is, do the terms of the Launch Service Purchase Act preclude the development of a vehicle with government funds that can be used for commercial launch? And if it doesn't, should we as an organization push for that and make all this discussion of what the total development costs are within the government move on?
There's been a lot of talk on the Hill in recent months about government or industry consortia, about government, industry, cooperative endeavors, relationships. No, I don't. It's been a while since I've read in detail the Commercial Launch Services Act. I don't think it precludes that. If it does, it was not the intent. The intent of our committee is to make launch activities as commercial and as operational as can be.
Okay, that answers my question.
I think the gentleman behind you there.
Yeah, I just have one simple question. I've been around with technical arguments about the mass fractions and other tank
it's ready and when engines are available. We seem to have a team, we have a team over McDonnell Douglas with proven track record of getting bird out 2 years of flying it and, you know, and nothing burning up. Isn't it worth the half the cost of a shuttle mission, which is $300 million to, well, I'm using Norman Augustine's numbers. Norman admitted the 600 for a shuttle. Anyway, isn't it worth $300 million to let them go out and try to build the SX2, integrate these technologies, what they have right now available, see where they need to work, and then go on and do the next stage with a commercial consortium or however they want to do it. But let's just get some hardware flying out there and a test platform for the new engines.
They don't know whether to say so. When the National Research Council looked at the DCX program, they said there's some work of potential value here, but money shouldn't be wasted on the DCX because it doesn't do anything. It really hasn't been done before. And that the money should be directed to advancing the technologies that are required to build the bigger machines. I once said that the person who came up with the concept of doing the DCX, and maybe it was Max, was a marketing genius. Took something that wasn't terribly difficult to do, hadn't really been done before, and in describing the thing as a 1/3 scale model of a operational SSTO, leaves the misimpression that all you got to do is scale the thing up 3 times and you're there. In fact, none of the materials that are used in the DCX would be used in a real SSTO. None of the propulsion that's used in the DCX would be used in a real SSTO. We've done vertical takeoff and landings before. We did it in the service of the moon. We did it in astronaut training programs leading to operational land flights. What they did demonstrate, and I take my hat off to the team, is that it doesn't take hundreds or thousands of white smock PhDs to process and launch rockets. That is something they did demonstrate, but a number of, almost everybody else in the world had demonstrated that already, not with a smaller crew and not on a reusable system. So there were some things that were demonstrated by the DCX. But I think its value has been more as a marketing tool to generate a lot of interest in this technology than as a useful demonstration.
Let me just get a follow-up on this real quick. I mean, you look at the view graphs and you did some digging in, right? They tested the launch processing, you didn't mention the control software, which they broke record time at, and that's handled by a firm up in Massachusetts that did some of that work. And right, it is a marketing tool. They got something out there. They felt that rather than handing a paper, it was said, we'll hand in a rocket to fly, so let's do something useful. There's enough money there to do it. So I agree with that, but isn't it worth the risk of going out and spending $300 million? It looks like NASA's going to have its own money to do technology development in parallel to any DoD efforts of putting something like
Some things have happened that don't give me confidence. One of which is, one of my concerns is the reliability of the system. And when you build an SSTO, are you pushed into, because of the margins that you're forced to use, are you pushed into a less reliable system than you could otherwise build with a 2-stage reusable? A claim was made by an official of MacTech, not Mac, that all of the design margins of safety that are used on the DCX series or will be used in the bigger vehicles are commercial airline standards. I said, fine, give me a table. I want by component a listing of the major components of the system, and then you all build the DC-10 commercial aircraft, you build the Delta. You know, in this table, show me by component, what's the design margin of safety in the Delta? What's the design margin of safety, similar components in the DC-10? What's the design margin of safety in the DC-Y or Y prime or whatever the ultimate flying machine is, the Delta, the final one. I was promised that I would have that chart in a week. That was about 6 or 9 months ago, and I've never seen it.
They were building hardware. No more paper.
It was scary about flying airplanes.
I think I wasn't shown the chart because the assertion that was made isn't true.
No, it's true, but if you do that type of analysis,
I want to
we'll never fly an aircraft again.
Sure. I've got 15 years experience as an engineer. I've worked in a number of industries from aerospace to automobile industry. I currently working with a large automobile company, largely regarded as one of the most efficient in the world. In the area where I work at, they're building a car that's going to come out in 1998. Okay, relating this back to Delta Clipper, I just started this job recently. One thing that impressed me was that when I saw what this company was doing to design the car, they were doing exactly the same sort of thing that we're trying to do here. They don't sit there and have a bunch of scientists write a bunch of papers and then decide to go off and build a car. They build prototypes. In the studio where I'm at, they've got clay models of this car right all over the place. They've got components of it broken off for people to play with these. And these are real components doing real things. And they found because when you put people in research labs, it's very easy for them to ignore the hard problems. I worked in pure research myself. It's very easy when you get the grant to work on easy stuff and to ignore the hard problems. But if you have to build something that's got to actually fly, you can't do that. And that's why we got to get things flying. And that's why it's a waste of time to do this research on stuff that's already been researched and turn more green paper into more white paper. We got to get stuff flying. We got to go out and build something. Because that's what every private industry in the world does. They build prototypes and they stand them and they get them going. The U.S. rocket industry is the only group that doesn't do that. And why don't you start doing that?
I want to follow Alan's question on that.
No,
Mr. Dawson, how do you determine the design margins if you don't have a vehicle out there to test to see what your lengths, what your data is? We don't have
I'd like to give it. I'd like to hear why we build rockets the way we build cars, the way we build trains, the way we build everything else.
Except none of that flies.
Airplanes fly. We build
No, but I think his question is real good. My experience in structures. I'm not a structures type, but boy, have I suffered with those guys for decades. Everybody tends to put this now in their arguing material. But with you have good materials there, some good ways of making structures, lousy ways of making structures, some terrible, just plain geometry of structures things occur. One of the reasons Saturn S2B was so neat was the neat. The material was always where the forces wanted to go and that sort of thing. Now, with any degree of complexity in structure, computerization be damned, it gets pretty complex. Most of these guys came from the background of getting fired if the wing fell off the airplane. Structures people are inherently conservative and don't let them tell you anything else, even when you got hundreds of them working for you. I could never make those guys take a risk. And one of the things that has occurred in a number of airplanes is the airplane gets heavier and heavier and heavier in response. At the same time, they're learning more and more about the structure. And they fix it up for relatively small items, because now they know where it is. There's a learning process in good structures, not just the materials process. Materials helps, but it's the artistry with which you use the material. Most people don't understand it as artistry in the structure business. And that's one of the things that I think you'd be surprised how much better you might go in a bit of a step-by-step procedure.
But those are such problems you're not going to solve by giving someone $1 million grant and saying study the problem.
Oh, no, as a matter of fact, no, that's what I'm saying. I agree. But another point I'd like to make is all this goddamn research is so good. Why are we still demanding 15 and 20% margins? I thought you were supposed to be learning. all you can get out of NASA or anyone else is they have sent me research forever. And oh yes, I gotta put the same structural margin in there as a shuttle because I am responsible and I want to tell structure and I want to be responsible for everything else. Now, if the research motivates me to cut out the margins, stop the money in the research and start flying. That's a bit of a radical suggestion.
We got about 5 minutes left. Henry?
A data point on research versus flying. At Space Access 94, the MacJack people pointed out their best advanced research on the DCX landing predicted that just before landing, DCX would be fiercely unstable. The control system would have to work very hard to keep it upright and in the right place. It's not. The landing is utterly benign.
Bill, you get your hand up.
Okay. One question. When you were a kid building, you said the other night you built like 300 rocket engines in your basement. Why did you never fly them?
How about last week?
I'll take the hit on that. What I was doing was, at the time, the amateur rocket record was 7 miles. I had the design of the system that would go to 67 miles. And I was working on individual components leading to a flight of that vehicle, and I ran out of time. But no, I understand your point. I understand your point.
43.
And one more question here.
I have a question. You've made some good points about why single stage to orbit may not work. And I think that there's a validity there. Why not just order a 2-stage vehicle, 2 Delta Clippers stacked on top of each other? I mean, you'll get all the margins you mentioned. Why not? You can use regular aluminum, regular RL10s, or for that matter, the hydrocarbon engine from the Delta for the first stage. Order a 2-stage Delta Clipper style built thing and order them to start bending tin tomorrow.
Let me tell you why I wouldn't.
Okay.
First place, staging is a very seductive thing. As soon as you start staging the rocket, everybody wants to equal velocity in terms of each stage. And it does relieve your structure's requirements, and so you get sloppy with the damn structure. Don't get the impression that some of these vehicles are all surgical swamp types. Certainly not the Thor. That's the most used space booster in this country by a factor of 2. It was not done for surgical precision. We knew we had margin we could use. Now, if we assume that the things we talked about, it would be nice to eventually have a single stage tour. And if you're afraid you can't get there, you'd like to have some sort of a mini stage. Firefly people say the mini stage is an airplane. I'm not sure I like that. I kind of like MacJack's pop-like cruise, which was about 10 years ago. But if you had a single stage almost to orbit, you'd like to have a minimum stage supplement, which means, like my lectures, a disciplining organization can't do anything. And engineers have to be driven. Never give engineers a chance to have a committee action. Don't agree on what the hell happens. They have to be driven. You want to drive them for that single stage. And you have to supplement the stage. You want a minimum stage. And furthermore, it's going to be a little less efficient because you do not want to overload the basic vehicle the way we overload our upper stages now. I think one of the worst lack of perspective is what I mentioned before. Our upper stages take 1 node of heating compared to the structures on a single stage because the acceleration pattern of the rockets. That's one of the reasons why we now think, some of us, you can do single stage. But if you start out saying, let's do it 2-stage. Next guy in says, hey boss, let's do it right. Geez, you realize how easy we'll make the structures? You completely lose the thread of trying to drive that track.
There are still people that come into my office and claim in 2 years, $3 billion, they can have a workable, flyable NAPS. And they are as passionate on that and how easy it is to do and how all the technologies simple, it's easy. Just give us the money and we'll do it, get out of our way. And you know, I don't believe
What are the problems with a two-stage? What are the problems with a two-stage? I just gave you back all the margins. Now shoot me the other problems for a two-stage.
No, I don't.
Any system that we have now, that's all.
Let's just be where you're at.
You just got what you got.
You're just giving the reasons why we all went to staging decades ago.
Okay, Terry?
No,
We're trying to get out of it.
Buzz Aldrin is a big proponent of two-stage, recoverable, reusable. You know, the key to low cost, and I think we agree on this, is getting the marching army out and reusability. Yeah, it may take more time to process two things than one thing, and maybe the engineers aren't challenged as hard in a one-stage or in a two-stage thing as they would be a one-stage thing. But you know, I think the verdict is out, or the jury is out right now on what's the best way to go right now. In addition to these NASP people that come in, there are contractors that come in. There's one that working Washington very hard right now with a disposable solid propellant rocket system that will reduce costs by a factor of 10. There's another group with that argue the same thing with hybrids. There's another company that has a disposable liquid propellant rocket system that they say will reduce costs by a factor of 100. Simple, rugged, big dumb booster type concept. And everybody argues they got the solution. It's simple, it's easy. Just give them $2 billion, 5 years, they will all do it.
And one of them is right.
Every time we've done that, the people fail.
If you give the money to people who have track records, why don't you give the money to people who have track records? I guess that's actually, it's only. Yeah.
That company has a mixed track record. I can point to a number of programs that
they also have the most reliable rocket vehicle, the Dawson on Earth.
Absolutely.
And you especially last night, you implied that they didn't have a very good rocket vehicle.
Oh, no.
You did. You said that the United States has some of the most unreliable rockets are always blowing up. They're never going anywhere. The Delta happens to be the most reliable rocket on Earth today.
That's right.
It includes a Proton, it includes an Ariane space vehicle. So we do know how to build things.
Well, there may be one exception.
The problem with those rockets is that they're based on ICBM technology from the 1950s, which makes them expensive. And that's why we lose out the Ariane space, because their rockets are based on more contemporary technology. So that's expensive to operate. And in your mind's eye, I'd really like to know exactly what it is you want. Is it really a NASA technology generator? That's all a NASA is, and I like it for a technology generator, but it's not really going to be a rocket very soon, or an airplane, whatever. Or is it an NLS? The NLS, from what I understand, is dead. So I really would like to know in your mind's eye what it is that you want as far as a space launch system. No, tell us.
You can't.
I've been telling you the truth, everything I've said. No, you're right on the Delta, and there's a talk that I give to my congressional fellows that I praise the Delta system, and I use it to prove one of my key points.
Well, now you're praising it after it's been pointed out to you.
I can show you a public briefing I give where it is praised. The Delta, one of the problems with U.S. launch systems is they tend to be complex, fragile, performance-driven race cars. The vehicle in our current inventory that is the farthest away from that description is the Delta. And it is the cheapest, most reliable system we have. I argue with current systems, we need simple, rugged, cost-driven trucks. That's what other people are building. Other countries aren't beating us because they have high-tech systems. That's not the case. They have simple, rugged, cost-driven
Well, when you
trucks.
say that, I've been an NLS, and I don't think Congress is going to want to hear about funding for an NLS. Just the
NLS, all right. Yeah, I think there are some economic criteria that one has to consider. An NLS, the payback on an NLS, depending on the assumptions you make, is going to be between 80 and 200 years. NLS was a stupid program from the get-go. It didn't make sense if you had the money, or if you were in good budget times, and it's completely ridiculous in bad budget times. Now, one of the constraints that some of us in Congress are pushing for is if we're going to develop some systems, we have to do some things that make some economic sense. And we argue that a 10-year payback ought to be a reasonable criteria for a government-funded system. And so, no, I was almost nobody that believes in NLS. Now, there are some concepts out there for some new vehicles that are simple, rugged, cost-driven trucks and can have payback in 4 to 6 years, the contractors claim. They always overstate, so you double it. But we can develop systems that would be cheaper, require fewer people. I don't think the issue with current systems is ICBM technology. There's an experience all of us have in common. That's the trucks that deliver mail to our homes. You and I don't care how big that truck is. We don't care what color it is. We don't care what level of technology was required to design the truck. We don't care what level of technology was required to build the truck. We don't care what level of technology is required to operate the truck. Instead of using low-tech pneumatic tires, they could go to a maglev system. That'd be high-tech. It wouldn't be cheap. What we care about as users of the mail system is that our mail is delivered reliably, on time, at the lowest possible cost, because we're paying the bill. Those are the same things that owners and operators and payloads want. They want to be able to get into space reliably, when they want to, at a low cost. And they don't give two hoots and a damn whether it's a high-tech vehicle or a low-tech vehicle. They want a system that's going to work there when they need it at low cost. Now, one of the cheapest systems in the world today is one that was the first system in the world, and that's the Russian, the A series. The last 1,000 launches, I think it's failed 30 times or something. I mean, it's a very, very rugged, reliable system. It's one of the lowest cost systems in the world because they haven't changed. Now, clearly there are ways that technology can help us, and I'm pushing for advances in those technologies. But we're doing a lot of things today that are very stupid. Ballistic missiles, the Thor, the Atlas, the Titan, when they had warheads on them, they were maintained by a very, very small crew of people who could readily pull a missile out of the silo and replace it when it failed or had a problem. The launch crew consisted of 2 people, one of whom was there to make sure the other guy didn't start a war. And they could launch anytime, night or day, with moments' notice. Only when those systems became space launch systems did it take all of a sudden hundreds, in one case 1,000, white smock PhDs to process the launch. Well, we're doing something different with space launch systems that we didn't.
When they were sitting in their silos, we didn't really have an indication of how many of them would actually work. A good number of them probably would not have.
Well, periodically we pulled them out of the silos and launched them. I mean, they were called DASO tests, demonstration, shakedown, or operation.
I've been on a few of them on submarines.
Thor was not in a silo. It was stored horizontally unfueled with a shoulder rotor. In 15 minutes, the shoulder would pull back unless it would erect itself, fuel itself with kerosene and oxygen, take itself out and take off. We demonstrated that many times.
A lot of problems in space launch today is the way we do business. I mean, the NRO chooses to build their payloads on the launch pad. It takes them 3 to 4 months. Even if you had a rocket that could launch within 1 day of reaching the pad, if your customer's going to spend 4 months building his payload on the rocket, you got a pretty inefficient system. Titan production lines in this country, no 2 Titans are alike. Everyone is individually tailored to each individual satellite. That's stupid. Every rocket in this country is designed with a standard interface, with electrical and mechanical connections for payload. Every commercial customer in the world uses the standard.
You don't really have to say all these things to me, because I'm an SSTO supporter. I want to reduce the cost of launching payloads.
What else will compete with Proton?
Stanley, you brought up an element I'd like to make one, what I consider commentary on payback, long-range planning, life cycle cost. Doug was my program. Doug was one of my programs. The day we got the contract, I went back to Washington. The next day, we talked to Bill Rose and asked, and I got this lecture. Now, I know you pastors who have done this don't get any bright ideas. This is an interim launch vehicle, 12 vehicles, nothing else. And don't get any bright ideas of upgrading or making more or making more. And I get this long series of lectures. And I went home and lined up the troops and told them that. Well, the guy said, what are you going to do? And I said, we're going to make them all work and see if they got enough substantially. Halfway through the program, we were working, nobody else was. I got a call from the program manager at NASA, and said, you make that damn thing work once more. I don't think Gabe Silverstein's got anything being launched on anything else. I just say, wait. So there's some people in this business, be very careful about selling them an interim vehicle, letting them sell you an interim vehicle.
On that note, I think we're going to have to cut it short. Once again, I want to thank you very much.